have some kind of initial clarification. The first one, when I say America, including United States. And including the enormous population of indigenous people from the Mapuches to the First Nation of Canada that now are becoming very powerful, very active, very organizing themselves. And the forced migration of human beings enslaved in Africa and brought to the America, who built also a kind of original culture or civilization, one, as you want to call it. The second thing, when I will say I and we, I is I. When I say we, don't ask who are the we. The we are a group of people known now as the kind of modernity, coloniality, the Coloniality project. I am one of them. So when I say I am not representing them, but what I am saying owe a lot to almost 12, 14 years of conversation, meeting, writing, exchanging, co-writing, etc., etc. So, storytelling. Yes, storytelling seems to be the question, and the question is from where to start. Since I am American, we start from the Renaissance, because it was the Renaissance that changed the course of history. When we Americans of the South look at the Enlightenment and look at how the Enlightenment traced that line from Greece to Rome to modern Europe, they miss the big detour. And the big detour was the detour of the Atlantic, without which it's hard to imagine 18th century Europe and the Industrial Revolution. So that is the America I am talking to. And in that context, also that the storytelling is that, in relation to the question has been asked, we make a distinction very clear between colonialism and coloniality. Colonialism are historical and a specific time. So Spanish colonialism, Portuguese colonialism, Iberian colonialism, Dutch, English, French, United States. But we don't fit Roman colonialism into that picture, or any other civilizational or socio-cultural organization that today is called empire. But as I was said this morning, China was not an empire, it was a dynasty. Persia was not an empire, it was a Shahanate. The Ottoman was not an empire, it was a sultanate. So why to call it empire? So there were a lot of organizations, but the kind of coloniality that we see emerge in the 16th century goes together with what liberal and Marxists call capitalism. Rome was not, in our understanding, a capitalist empire, and the Roman colonies were not capitalist. So this is where we start our story. And the story begins with Pope Alexander VI. Pope Alexander VI in 1484 did something very, very surprising and very, that we take for granted today, but it was a great, great move. In the Treaty of Tordesillas, he divided what at the time was called the West Indias Occidentales, the West Indies. He divided, and then Indias Occidentales became the Western Hemisphere, so you know what I'm talking about. He divided the Indias Occidentales and gave half to the Portuguese and half to the Spanish. Isn't that amazing? The Pope kind of appropriated half of the planet and gave it to the Spanish and Portuguese. That was 1484. In 1529, the emperor, the king, no, it's not the emperor, the king of Spain and the king of Portugal, they really liked that idea. So in 1529, they signed the Treaty of Saragossa. And the Treaty of Saragossa, they divided among themselves the Indias Orientales. So we have Macau, Portuguese, we have Filipinas, and we have Formosa, the beautiful island that now is Taiwan, the Spanish. So the Pope and then the king appropriated the planet and divided Indias Occidentales and Indias Orientales, and then people say the East and the West is a construction. Yes, it's a construction. The question is, who did it? Why? What were the consequences? And the consequences are tremendous from our point of view. These are the two pillars of the foundation of Western civilization. There was no Western civilization until that moment. There were Western Christians at the west of Jerusalem after they lost the city in the Crusades. But after the Spanish and the Portuguese came the Dutch, and came the British, and came the French, and they began to build not just economically and politically, they continued to build epistemologically. So Western civilization became not only a kind of political and economic distribution of the world, but also build a justification of that action. And that is what I think Carl Schmitt saw it very clearly when he analyzed global linear thinking and the second nomos of the earth. Global linear thinking emerged in the 16th century. There was no international law until the 16th century. With that, divine law was natural law, human law. But international law is an invention of the 16th century because it was necessary to justify the appropriation and expropriation of land all over the planet. The School of Salamanca in Spain, then came Grotius, then came Locke, and so international law and was established. So, and Schmitt talked about the first nomos and the second nomos. The second nomos, 16th century, global linear thinking, was in this and is in this. And the first nomos, what was the first nomos for Schmitt? I call that Schmitt trick. He recognizes that before 1500, there were a lot of nomos on the earth. Nomos means what we can call today territoriality, people living, organizing a certain law that organized the territoriality. So there were many. But all of a sudden, he reduced them to the first nomos, and he kind of aligned the first nomos with the second nomos, and he fall into the kind of Western linear history of human being from the primitive or from the Big Bang, etc., to today. What is important here is think about the world before 1500, that moment in which Schmitt sees the second nomos appear and displace, erase the first nomos. As you can imagine, there was a lot of whatever you want to call it, because Western civilization not only built itself as Western civilization, but invented the word of Western civilization to talk about all other organizations that were not necessarily called themselves civilizations. So we're in this kind of semantic, philosophical trap. So the question is that before 1500, There was a lot of nomos, I mean, the Chinese, the Persian, the Indian, the Incas, the Aztec, the Kingdom of Africa, even Europe, Western Christian in Europe. But there were two things that is important to underline in that moment, that there was no one single, let's call it civilization, that impinged all over the others. There was commerce, of course. We will have a talk on the Silk Road today and yesterday. There was a lot of commerce, I mean, and Venice, Florence, Genova, they have a great commerce with Baghdad, with the Silk Road, etc. But there was no, as I said, one civilization that impinged over the other. And the second is that was a pluri-center world order. A pluri-center world order and non-capitalist world orders. And all of a sudden, the 16th century comes. With the Spanish, with the Portuguese, with the French, the Dutch, and the British fighting for control, which finally they arrive in the 18th century to displace the Iberian Peninsula. So what happened at that moment in those 2 centuries for us is, as I said before, the foundation of Western civilization. Yeah? Okay. And let me just give briefly some of the issues we are analyzing there. Well, the first time in the history of the humankind, and I'm making here a big statement, but I mean, I have 20 minutes and I have to kind of cut it short. So if you accuse me of generalizing, I agree with you, but I will just go. The first time in the history of humankind that a group of human beings found themselves with the possibility of appropriating an enormous mass of land, what become called the Americas. When you have a tremendous amount of land, a kind of consequences is that you need labor. And they use the indigenous labor first for mining, gold and silver, and one of the two economic structures that was the encomienda. What the encomienda was, that was already in Spain in a kind of smaller scale, but the king gave to the conquistadores enormous piece of land with the Indians to work the land. And that land could be mountains and with gold and silver, with the condition that the conquistador, the encomendero, will teach the Indian Spanish and Christian doctrine. Obviously, they didn't, right? So one of the consequences was exploitation of labor and other kind of issues. The indigenous population began to diminish, so the question was to bring African slaves, or enslaved African. So massive amount of land, massive exploitation of labor. Massive exploitation of labor and land to do what? To produce commodities for a global market. And one of the consequences that is last from there to today, and that is one of the things we are doing, make the connection, the narrative that connects what happened in the 16th century with today, is the dispensability or disposability of human life. Slaves were there before. They were of all colors. But in the 16th century, a slave became a commodity. And as a commodity, they became disposable. And the moment that became disposable, something very important happened. That gain, benefit, economic benefit, took precedence over the value of human life. When the Industrial Revolution happened in the 18th century, the rule of the game was already settled. And a revolution that was made upon the basis of natural resources take us today to dispensability of life in general, not just of human life. So that are some of the elements that we are kind of discussing to see in the 16th century. The formation of what is going on today. Fred asked to think about how we end up where we ended up. I mean, I don't know who is, if there are causes or whoever, but the question is that there is a structure of management that we call the colonial matrix of power that, as was said this morning, the colonial matrix of power that was made by human beings ended up by kind of managing the manager. And that's what kind of Fanon said, to decolonize doesn't mean only to decolonize the colonizer, had to decolonize the colonizer too. And that's what I heard this morning, was that the decolonization of the mind means, in our understanding, to move in a different direction, and I will end up my talk with that different direction. But before going to that, let me continue with my narrative. What happened between 1500 and 2000, with many changes in between, many disorders. The first chaotic moment came more or less between 1750 and 1850, when the Great Revolution happened, the French Revolution happened, the Haiti Revolution happened, the American Revolution happened, the US Revolution happened, the independence of all Spanish American countries happened. So that was the first wave of, after World War II, was called decolonization. A lot of things happened there. I don't have time to go into detail, but what is important for my argument is that in the year 2000, something also began to happen that began to produce significant changes in that story, and for us, explain a big deal of the world disorder today. So what is that? This is what we theorize, and this is the hypothesis. For 500 years, that kind of monster that we call the colonial matrix of power, that logic of coloniality, that darker side of modernity, because another thesis we have that there is no modernity without coloniality. When Giddens said, from now, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, from now on is modernity all the way down, we said we are foutu, because it will be coloniality all the way down. So what happened in these 500 years is that the colonial matrix of power was created out of necessity. I mean, it was not that the colonial matrix of power, the Spanish had it as a cookie cutter and just went and put it on the Americas. It emerged out of the necessity of what to do of this new situation: land, labor, etc., but also the need to understand what kind of human being are those human beings we didn't know. So that is another venue that I don't have time here to explain, but I will say that racism, as we know it today, also emerged in the philosophy of the time, trying to justify that Indians and Africans were lesser human, and as lesser human, they were kind of available for the humanist of the Renaissance. The concept of the human man is as the white male European Christian of the Renaissance, so the concept of the human became the standard to kind of classify the lesser human, including, of course, women, all around the world, and not just women, but women of color, because white women and Christian women in Europe have a privilege, not in relation to male, but yes, in relation to women of non-white color and other kind of religion or persuasion. So, coming back to the story, is that in those 500 years, that we can call westernization of the world. That is what Serge Latouche, a study of 1982, wonderful study of how the Western defined itself at the same time that was said this morning too, trying to kind of westernize the rest of the world. So that ended in 2000. It's not that, ended. Something began to change, and what began to change is that for the first time, not exactly the first time I entered here, for the first time in those 500 years, people of color, of non-white color, began to dispute the control of the colonial matrix of power. I said not the first time because Japan made an attempt in 1895, but then we know the story. But this is the first time, 2000, that really a strong challenge of the colonial matrix of power is presented. Dispute, not to question the nature of coloniality, but who called the shot. And in 2000 was already seen that China, from the other part of the world where I'm talking about, that China was raising, was coming back. Then shortly after that, the BRICS was mentioned this morning too. And this is for us what is important on the BRICS. There is a lot of things that are important in the BRICS, but I don't have time to go into that. I just want you one element that goes into my argument. It's the first time in 500 years that knowledge and capital of, if you wish, money and meaning began to be disputed by people of color. And you say, oh, but Russians are white. Well, yeah, but we know that Dostoevsky said, in the East we are king, and in Europe we are a cockroach. So that kind of pretends that history of Russia, from Peter and Catherine to the Soviet Union, there was that kind of tense relation, and I think we see it clearly now in the politics of Putin. There is a complex situation there, but I think that this kind of humiliation that people suffer through races is not just at the level of the lower classes. I think it's at the level also of the state, not necessarily the bankers, but yes, the politics of the state. So some people say, well, but Brazilians are white. Well, not so. They are either mestizos, and there are a lot of indigenous and Afro. And in any case, even if they are white, like me, Argentinian, we are off-white. We are almost white, because whiteness is not just a color, whiteness is a geopolitical classification. So this, for the first time, in 2000, with the BRICS, and now we are seeing, and this is what I think, is explain a big deal of the kind of disorder that we are in today. And I think that we have to be prepared to live with that disorder for a while. I don't know what is going to happen now. Of course, I don't have a crystal ball. But what we are seeing in this dispute for the control of colonial measure of power is what is being, I mean, I call it, but other people too call de-Westernization. What de-Westernization means, I mean, I saw the first time de-Westernization in Naqib Al-Attah's Islamism and Secularism and Islamism. He has a chapter on de-Westernization of knowledge. And then de-Westernization of knowledge became Islamization of knowledge, and then became very kind of problematic because, I mean, the debate, kind of fundamentalism and all this kind of thing. So I want to separate de-Westernization of knowledge from Islamization of knowledge. Islamization of knowledge will be one way to debate the question of de-Westernization. And you know, Ashish, this kind of issue discussed in Penn, right, in the decolonizing our university. But de-Westernization of knowledge doesn't have to take necessarily the Islamization. The second time I saw de-Westernization was in Huntington. I don't know if he knew Al-Attah's or not, but for Al-Attah's, de-Westernization was a positive way to go whatever you think about. For Huntington, de-Westernization was a problem, right? De-Westernization is coming, said Huntington more or less, and we have to make all possible, all is our power to kind of keep the West going. 3 books were published a year ago, one by Kissinger, the other by Brezhnev, and the other by Fukuyama. It's amazing, they all coincide that the United States as a world leader is in trouble. And all coincide that the world needs a leader, and the only leader is United States. So that is created, and I think that the world disorder will increase. Why? Because it's very hard to lose privilege. So the third time I heard the word de-Westernization was by Mahbubani, Kishore Mahbubani, the director of the public school in Singapore. And when he used de-Westernization there, is already to articulate the politics that kind of, especially East Asian countries, are kind of unfolding. This morning, somebody asked about the question of whether we should talk about capitalism with a Chinese characteristic or neoliberalism with the Chinese characteristics. And I think Galton gave a good answer. China is capitalist, but is far from being neoliberal, unlike Singapore. So this is the question. The question is that the dispute for the control of the colonial mixture of power, economically, politically, militarily, but also epistemically. And epistemically in this sense, I mean, touches also technology. I think that Germany and United States know that still they are ahead controlling technology. And I think Russia and China knows that they need to do that. So that is the dispute is at every level. There is something interesting going at the level of culture that I don't have time to talk here, but I will mention, especially in the Gulf countries, with the kind of museum, biennales, and all these kind of things. So let me go to the first question was, how did we get into this mess? My answer is, well, that is how history of the history of coloniality unfolded, and this is what engendered, and this is the dispute. So the question is how to get out of here. I have no idea. I have no idea, but I I have a few examples. And I finish with that, 3 points. Probably, I don't know if you read, and if you read, you remember Karl Polanyi, The Great Transformation. He has a fantastic thesis there. The problem is that the book kind of developed a lot of narrative to explain the thesis, but he didn't develop the thesis, so the thesis kind of got lost. And I think it's very important today to think about where are we going, and several things have been already said in this room. The thesis, Polanyi's thesis, is that toward 1850, the Great Transformation is at the moment in which land, labor, and money become commodities. And when land, labor, and money become commodity, especially land and labor, and Polanyi is very clear about that. He said, land, which is nature, cannot be a commodity because it's life. That is what we are saying today. And that is what indigenous people have been saying all the way. Labor is life also. But, I mean, we kind of erase the fact that we need to live, we need to work. But what happened in that great transformation is that little by little, we work to live. I mean, we live to work, right? So if you take that, and I give you 2 examples of today, I mean, how that kind of continues, what kind of shape takes today. And I have 2 examples here. One is what we talked this morning, the Greek referendum. I think the Greek referendum was a tremendous victory in spite of the problems and the disadvantage of negotiation. But I will distinguish victory from negotiation. The victory is that the referendum made clear to everybody in the world that for the state, the European Union, and for the bank, life is dispensable, is disposable. People don't count. I think that became very, very clear. And that is what happened with the slavery. That is what Polanyi saw with the Great Transformation, when land and labor become commodity. And here we are still in a growing scale of dispensability of human life. I give you a very funny example to just help you to understand what I'm trying to say. There was in the newspaper the other day, there are fantastic plans to use the small space in the airplanes to put more people. So they are talking about 2 stages, and will be like a couchette, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I don't know what's going to happen there, but I think when I read that, I think this is a kind of luxury version of the slave boat in the 16th century and the boat crossing the Mediterranean in the 20th century. So little by little, those airplanes can come like that. So the question is, this is the stage we are, I mean, not just the conflict between the dispute for the colonial mixture of power, but the most serious problem we have to face today is that everything that is being done to reduce cost and to increase gain. And you can talk about sustainable development all you want, but if you don't change that presupposition, we will remain for a long time where we are. And I finish with everybody was giving recommendation to Jack Hunin what to do with the think tank. Well, I will pitch in my recommendation. I think that what is needed is a kind of investigation that no foundation today will found. We cannot, with the idea I will propose, go to the Mellon Foundation, to the Rockefeller Foundation, and say, listen, we want to investigate how is it that you made such money, and how is it that you are giving money to do research that will increase the condition in which human life continue to be dispensable. So what happened in the Great Transformation is that the cart was put in front of the horse. The challenge is to get the cart behind the horse. And that, I think, is a difficult task, because not just the militaries, but the university and the think tanks and other institutions will do what they can to prevent that this kind of investigation takes place. So thank you very much for your attention.